I need to see your identification, now.
I'm busy keeping this man from bleeding to death. You are actively interfering.
I gave you a lawful order.
Take your hands off me!
You're under arrest for obstruction.
The air on Interstate 10 was a toxic cocktail of burnt rubber, spilled gasoline, and the metallic tang of sheared steel. It was just past 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, the sun already a merciless white disk in the Arizona sky, baking the asphalt and glinting off a mile-long sea of paralyzed vehicles. At the epicenter of the chaos was a 4-car pileup, a violent accordion of metal that had turned the westbound lanes into a scrapyard. Amid the wreckage, paramedic Elena Rostova moved with a focus that bordered on serene. The noise, the distant wail of more approaching sirens, the angry honking of trapped commuters, the groans of the injured, was a familiar symphony. It was the soundtrack of her life's work. Her patient was a man in his late 40s, the driver of a sedan that was now half the length it should be. He was pinned behind the steering wheel, his breathing shallow and rapid, his face a ghostly white. Classic signs of massive internal bleeding. Every second was a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass of his life. "We need to extricate now," she yelled to the firefighters working with the jaws of life. "His pressure is dropping fast. He's going into shock." She was reaching into her medical bag for a second IV line when a shadow fell over her. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the vehicle." The voice was young, laced with an aggressive, unearned authority. Elena didn't look up. Her hands, steady and sure, continued preparing the catheter. "I'm the lead paramedic. This man is a critical trauma. I'm not going anywhere." The heavy thud of combat boots on pavement grew closer. "I'm Officer Mark Corbin, and this is now a crime scene. I'm ordering you to clear the immediate area." This time, Elena glanced up. He couldn't have been more than 30. His jaw was set in a hard line, his hand resting near the butt of his sidearm. His eyes, hidden behind reflective sunglasses, betrayed nothing, but his posture screamed confrontation. He was a man accustomed to immediate compliance. "Officer," Elena said, her voice a blade of calm in the chaotic wind. "My patient is dying. Your crime scene will be a homicide scene if we don't get him out and on the way to a trauma center in the next 5 minutes. Now you can either help or you can step aside." The firefighters paused their work, the hydraulic tool whining down. They looked from Elena to the officer, sensing a new, unnecessary point of friction. For a moment, Corbin seemed taken aback, as if the concept of someone in his presence having a more urgent priority was a foreign language. "I need to see your identification, now," he demanded, his voice rising. "It's in the ambulance," Elena shot back, her attention already returned to her patient. "I'm a little busy keeping this man from bleeding to death. You are actively interfering with emergency medical care." That was the phrase that seemed to flip a switch. Corbin's face flushed a deep red. To him, this wasn't a jurisdictional disagreement. It was a personal challenge. It was insubordination. He stepped forward, his body blocking her access to the crushed car door. "I gave you a lawful order. You will obey it." From the periphery, Elena was vaguely aware of a dozen smartphones pointed in their direction, recording from the stranded cars nearby. She could feel the situation spiraling, but her training, her entire professional ethos, formed a bedrock of resolve. The patient came first, always. "I have a legal and moral duty to this man," she said, locking eyes with the reflection in his sunglasses. "A duty that supersedes your need to see my ID right this second. Now, for the last time, get out of my way." Corbin's response was swift and decisive. He grabbed her arm. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." The words were so absurd, so disconnected from the life and death reality of the scene, that Elena almost laughed. The firefighters stared in disbelief. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby onlookers. "Take your hands off me," she said, her voice dangerously low. "You are making a catastrophic mistake." But Corbin was committed. He was a man who never backed down, who believed doubling down was the same as being right. He twisted her arm behind her back with a practiced, painful efficiency. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "My patient," she managed to say, her voice cracking for the first time as he pulled her away from the wreckage. "Someone help my patient!" The last thing she saw before Corbin shoved her toward his patrol car was the face of the man in the sedan, his eyes wide with fear, a silent plea to the woman who was trying to save him but was now being dragged away in handcuffs. The cameras kept rolling. To understand why Elena Rostova did not flinch, why she did not cower or immediately comply in the face of Officer Corbin's belligerent authority, you had to understand where she came from. She wasn't just a paramedic. She was a product of one of the most demanding and unforgiving training pipelines in the United States military. For 6 years, she had worn the scarlet beret of an Air Force pararescueman, a PJ. Her job had been to drop from the sky into the world's most hostile environments: the jagged peaks of Afghanistan, the dense jungles of the Philippines, the storm-tossed waters of the Pacific, for one reason: to save lives. She had performed emergency tracheotomies in the back of a shuddering Black Hawk helicopter under enemy fire. She had set broken bones and sutured arterial bleeds in near-total darkness, hundreds of miles from the nearest hospital. Her guiding principle, the motto of the pararescue community, was tattooed not on her skin, but on her soul. "These things we do, that others may live." Her instructors at Kirtland Air Force Base had forged her into a unique hybrid. Part trauma medic, part mountaineer, part scuba diver, part survival expert. They had pushed her to the absolute limits of physical and mental endurance, breaking her down and rebuilding her into someone who could remain clinically calm while the world fell apart around her. They taught her that panic was a luxury you could never afford, and that hesitation was a killer. More importantly, they taught her about the hierarchy of needs in a crisis. The mission, saving the life, was paramount. Everything else, from personal comfort to bureaucratic procedure, was secondary. You didn't stop chest compressions to fill out a form. You didn't delay splinting a compound fracture to answer a question that could wait. You acted. You stabilized. You saved. After 2 combat tours and a collection of commendations she kept in a box in her closet, Elena had transitioned to civilian life, seeking to continue her mission on home soil. She'd found that the chaos of a major urban emergency medical system was a different kind of war zone, but the core principles remained the same. The skills were directly transferable. Assessing a multi-casualty scene was no different than triaging wounded soldiers. Making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information was a Tuesday. She had earned a reputation at the Phoenix Fire Department as preternaturally calm, an anchor of competence during the city's worst moments. Her colleagues respected her, not just for her skill, but for her quiet, unshakable confidence. She never raised her voice, but when she gave an order at a scene, it was followed without question, because everyone knew it was based on a depth of experience most of them could barely imagine. She had dealt with police officers her entire career, thousands of them. The vast majority were professional partners in the chaotic dance of emergency response. They secured scenes, controlled crowds, and protected the medics while they worked. She understood their role and respected their authority. But she had also encountered the other kind. Officers who saw a crisis not as a problem to be solved, but as a stage on which to perform their authority. Men like Corbin, who radiated an insecurity that could only be soothed by absolute, unquestioning obedience. Her military background had prepared her for them, too. It had taught her how to recognize a brand of leadership that was based on intimidation rather than respect. And it had taught her that you never, ever let a bully's ego compromise the mission. When Officer Corbin laid his hands on her, he wasn't just arresting a paramedic. He was confronting a veteran who had faced down threats far greater than a man with a badge and a fragile sense of control. He thought he was asserting his authority. He had no idea he was just another obstacle between Elena Rostova and her patient. And for her, obstacles were meant to be overcome, not obeyed. The back of a patrol car is a uniquely dehumanizing space. The hard plastic of the bench, the thick plexiglass partition, the lack of interior door handles. It's all designed to strip you of agency, to reinforce the absolute power dynamic between the captured and the captor. For Elena, sitting with her hands cuffed painfully behind her, the most jarring part was the silence. The symphony of the chaotic scene she'd just been torn from was replaced by the low hum of the car's engine and the intermittent squawk of the police radio. Through the rear window, she could see the scene shrinking, the flashing lights of her own ambulance, Unit 61, becoming smaller and more distant. She had left her partner, David, to manage the extrication and care of her patient alone. A fresh wave of fury, cold and sharp, washed over her. It wasn't for herself. It was for the man in the car, the stranger whose life was now in greater jeopardy because of one officer's arrogance. She closed her eyes and forced herself back into a clinical mindset. She ran through her breathing exercises, the same ones she'd used in the back of helicopters to steady her hands for a delicate procedure. Stay calm. Assess. Plan. Up front, Officer Corbin was already crafting his version of events. His voice, now calm and official, was a stark contrast to the aggressive bully he had been just minutes before. "Dispatch, this is 4 Adam 12, he said into his radio. "Show me en route to central booking with one adult female in custody. Charge is 13-2508, obstructing governmental operations." A pause. "Be advised, subject was a paramedic on scene, became belligerent and uncooperative, refused multiple lawful orders to provide identification and clear the scene, had to be physically restrained." Elena listened to the string of half-truths and outright lies, a meticulously constructed narrative designed to paint her as the aggressor and him as the peacekeeper. Belligerent, uncooperative, physically restrained. He was using the language of the system, the specific legal codes and jargon that would trigger a predictable, self-justifying bureaucratic response. He was building his fortress of plausible deniability, brick by brick, over the public airwaves. She knew that his incident report would be a work of fiction, polished to perfection, detailing how he had arrived on a chaotic scene and attempted to restore order, only to be met by a rogue medic who posed a danger to herself and others. It was a standard playbook. The radio crackled again, this time a different voice, deeper and more authoritative. It was probably his sergeant monitoring the call. 4 Adam 12, what was the nature of the interference? Was the paramedic impeding fire rescue operations? Negative, Sergeant, Corbin replied smoothly. She was impeding my ability to secure the scene and conduct my initial investigation. It was an officer safety issue. Officer safety, the ultimate trump card. The two words that could be used to justify almost any action, no matter how unreasonable. Elena leaned her head back against the partition, the metal digging into her scalp. Corbin had no idea what he had just done. He thought he had won a contest of wills on the side of a highway. He thought he had put an uppity woman in her place. He didn't realize he had just handcuffed a walking, breathing repository of evidence. She was a trained medical professional who could articulate with chilling precision exactly how his 7-minute power trip had directly compromised a patient's chances of survival. He didn't know about the dozens of witnesses with their phones out. He didn't know about the firefighters who had watched the whole thing unfold. And most importantly, he didn't know that the small, blinking red light on his own chest had been recording everything. He was driving a car full of reasonable doubt, and the star witness was sitting in his back seat. The drive to the station was only 10 minutes, but in the sterile silence of the cruiser, Elena began methodically building her own report in her head. A timeline of events so precise and detailed that it would leave no room for misinterpretation. Corbin had started a war of paperwork. He was about to find out he was hopelessly outgunned. The central booking area of the Phoenix Police Department was a place of controlled chaos, a constant flow of human misery processed under the flat, indifferent glare of fluorescent lights. When Officer Corbin walked in with Elena in tow, a few heads turned. It wasn't every day you saw a paramedic in full uniform being brought in handcuffs. Corbin projected an air of nonchalant confidence, guiding Elena toward the intake desk as if this was the most routine arrest of his shift. The booking sergeant, a weary-looking veteran named Miller with 2 decades on the job, looked up from his computer, his eyes scanning from Elena's uniform to Corbin's face. "What do we got, Corbin?" Miller asked, his tone flat. "Obstruction," Corbin said, pushing a preliminary arrest form across the counter. "Paramedic on the I-10 pileup. Refused to identify. Wouldn't clear the scene." Miller picked up the form, his eyes lingering on the listed occupation. He looked at Elena again, taking in her calm demeanor, the absence of the usual fear or intoxication he saw in the people who came through these doors. He'd seen Elena Rostova before, bringing in patients from scenes, always professional, always composed. Something didn't add up. "You arrested a paramedic while she was working a multi-car pileup?" Miller asked, a hint of incredulity creeping into his voice. "She was interfering with my investigation, Sarge," Corbin reiterated, his jaw tightening slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned. The process began. They removed the handcuffs, the sudden release of pressure sending a pins and needles sensation through Elena's hands. They took her photo. They fingerprinted her. They inventoried her belongings. As the young officer at the inventory desk pulled items from her pockets and tactical vest, a pile began to form on the counter that told a story. Her wallet, containing her state paramedic license and her advanced cardiac life support certification. Her shears, a roll of medical tape, a folded stethoscope, and then, from a zippered pocket, a small laminated card. The officer picked it up. On it was a photo of a much younger Elena in military fatigues, and the words, "United States Air Force Pararescue." The young officer looked at the card, then up at Elena with a new expression, a mixture of confusion and respect. He showed the card to Sergeant Miller. Miller read the card, his eyebrows rising. He looked over at Corbin, who was leaning against a wall, scrolling on his phone, trying to look bored. Miller walked over to him, holding the ID card. "Corbin," he said, his voice low but firm. "Did you know she was a PJ?" Corbin glanced at the card, his bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. "Doesn't matter what she was," he mumbled. "She was obstructing." But the seed of doubt had been planted. The narrative of an out-of-control, belligerent medic was becoming harder to sell. An hour into her holding cell stay, the door buzzed open. A man in a tailored suit stood there, a leather briefcase in his hand. He had sharp eyes and an air of coiled energy. "Ms. Rostova? I'm Samuel Drake. Your partner David called your union. They called me," he said, extending a hand. "Let's get you out of here." Elena shook his hand. "Thank you for coming." Drake's eyes scanned the holding cell, then her face. "Tell me everything. Don't leave out a single detail." For the next 20 minutes, Elena recounted the events with the dispassionate precision of a medic delivering a patient report. The patient's condition, the timeline, Corbin's exact words, her responses, the presence of witnesses. Drake listened intently, making occasional notes on a legal pad. He didn't interrupt. When she was finished, he closed the pad. "He never read you your rights, did he?" "No," Elena said. "And at no point did you physically resist?" "Never. My hands were on my patient or my medical kit until he grabbed me." Drake nodded slowly. A thin, confident smile touched his lips. "Officer Corbin thinks this is about a misdemeanor obstruction charge," he said. "He has no idea this is about to become a federal civil rights case. They didn't just arrest a paramedic, Ms. Rostova. They arrested their own worst nightmare, a perfect plaintiff." The release from the holding cell felt like emerging from a deep-sea dive. The stale, recycled air of the precinct was replaced by the warm, dry heat of the late afternoon. Her partner, David, was waiting by the front steps, his face etched with a mixture of relief and fury. He handed her a bottle of water. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm fine," Elena said, though the red marks on her wrists told a different story. "The patient. What happened?" David's expression darkened. "It was bad, Elle, really bad. By the time we got him extricated, he'd lost a lot more blood. He coded on the way to the hospital." Elena's stomach clenched. "Did they get him back?" Yeah, they got a pulse back just as we rolled into the trauma bay, but it was touch and go. They rushed him straight into surgery, ruptured spleen and a liver laceration. The surgeon told me, he said the delay was critical. Another 5 minutes and he would have bled out on the highway. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The delay. The time spent arguing with Corbin. The time she spent in handcuffs. That was the real crime that had been committed on the interstate. Not obstruction of justice, but a theft of the most precious commodity on earth. Time. Her lawyer, Samuel Drake, walked up beside them, his phone pressed to his ear. He concluded his call and turned to Elena. That was the deputy city attorney, he said, his tone all business. They know they have a problem. They're already extending an offer to drop all charges immediately in exchange for a release of liability. They want to make this go away before the sun sets. He paused, watching her face. Basically, they're offering a quiet apology and hoping you'll be so relieved to have the charges dropped that you'll walk away. Elena looked from Drake to David, then back toward the police station, a monolithic block of concrete and tinted glass. Inside that building, Officer Corbin was likely finishing his report, the official document that would paint him as a hero and her as a criminal. She thought of the patient on an operating table, his life hanging by a thread because that officer couldn't stand having his authority questioned. A quiet apology wasn't just insufficient, it was an insult. It was an attempt to bury the truth under a pile of legal paperwork. No, Elena said, her voice clear and steady. Absolutely not. Drake's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. That's what I assumed you'd say, he replied. I told them we'd be in touch. He turned to face her directly. I need you to understand what comes next. If we refuse, we're not just fighting the charges. We're filing a federal lawsuit against Officer Corbin and the city of Phoenix. We'll be accusing them of violating your Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and malicious prosecution. We'll argue that his actions constituted a reckless endangerment of a civilian's life. It will be long. It will be ugly. They will dig into your life, your career, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. He let the weight of his words sink in. Are you prepared for that? Elena met his gaze without hesitation. This morning I was arrested for doing my job. A man almost died because of it. If we let them bury this, it will happen again. To another medic, to another patient. This isn't just about me anymore, is it? No, Ms. Rostova, Drake said, a genuine smile finally appearing. It isn't. This is about drawing a line. We're going to make them wish they had never, ever crossed it. As they walked toward the parking lot, Elena felt the last vestiges of shock and confusion burn away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just an incident. It was a mission, and the objective was not apology. It was accountability. The opening salvo of a federal lawsuit isn't a dramatic courtroom confrontation. It's a quiet, relentless blizzard of paperwork. In the weeks that followed Elena's arrest, Samuel Drake's law firm transformed into a command center. The initial complaint was filed, a 40-page document that laid out the facts of the case with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It named Officer Mark Corbin and the city of Phoenix as defendants, alleging a litany of civil rights violations. The city's predictable response was a motion to dismiss, claiming Corbin was entitled to qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shields officers from liability. It was a standard defensive move, and Drake's team was prepared for it. They countered with a detailed response, arguing that no reasonable officer would believe it was lawful to arrest a paramedic actively engaged in life-saving treatment. While the lawyers battled over legal theory, the real work began, the discovery process. It was a methodical, painstaking hunt for evidence, and Drake's first target was Officer Corbin himself. They sent a formal request for production of documents to the city, demanding access to Corbin's entire personnel file, his training records, performance reviews, use of force reports, and most importantly, every single civilian complaint filed against him since he joined the force 8 years prior. The city's attorneys initially stalled, burying Drake's team in procedural objections and redacted files. But Drake was persistent, filing motions to compel and threatening sanctions until the documents finally began to trickle in. What they found was alarming. On paper, Mark Corbin was a model officer. His performance reviews were consistently positive, filled with praise for his proactive and decisive policing. He had received multiple commendations. But when they cross-referenced this glowing record with the civilian complaint file, a second, much darker picture emerged. Over his 8-year career, 37 separate complaints had been filed against Corbin. The allegations painted a portrait of a man with a dangerously short fuse. Excessive force during routine traffic stops, illegal searches, verbal abuse, and a recurring theme of escalating minor situations into major confrontations. The most disturbing part wasn't the number of complaints, but the outcome of the internal investigations. Every single one, all 37, had been closed with the same finding: unfounded or exonerated. Not a single complaint had resulted in any disciplinary action beyond a token verbal counseling on 2 occasions. To Drake, this was a massive red flag. A complaint history like that didn't point to a single bad officer. It pointed to a system that was actively protecting him. "No one is this unlucky," Drake said to his team, spreading the complaint summaries across a large conference table. "Good cops might get a few complaints over a career. Bad cops get a lot. But a cop who gets 37 complaints and is cleared on every single one? That's not a cop. That's a protected species." The legal team began the laborious process of tracking down the individuals who had filed those old complaints. Many had moved or were reluctant to get involved again, but some were willing to talk. They told stories that were eerily similar. A college student pulled over for a broken taillight, then yanked from his car and slammed against the hood for moving too slowly. A woman who had called police to a domestic dispute, only to be threatened with arrest herself by Corbin for having an attitude. A business owner who had questioned Corbin's authority to search his premises without a warrant and found himself in handcuffs for interfering. In every story, the pattern was the same: a minor issue, a challenge to Corbin's absolute authority, and an immediate, overwhelming, and often physical response. He was a bully with a badge, and it became clear that the department's Internal Affairs Division was not investigating his behavior, but rather manufacturing justifications for it. The lawsuit was no longer about a single wrongful arrest on the I-10. It was about exposing a deeply entrenched culture of impunity that had allowed a predator like Mark Corbin to flourish. Elena's case was just the one that had finally happened in broad daylight, with dozens of cameras rolling. In the modern legal battlefield, there is often one piece of evidence that transcends all arguments, all testimony, and all legal maneuvering. It is the objective, unblinking eye of the camera. After weeks of legal wrangling, the city was finally compelled to release the full, unedited footage from Officer Mark Corbin's body camera. Samuel Drake and his team gathered in a darkened conference room to watch it for the first time. The video file was labeled I-10_obstruction_Rostova. What they saw was even more damning than they had imagined. The footage began with Corbin arriving at the chaotic accident scene. For the first 2 minutes, he did standard police work, directing traffic and speaking with other officers. Then, he approached the crushed sedan where Elena was working. The camera, mounted on his chest, provided a clear first-person view of the entire encounter. It captured the firefighters working frantically with the jaws of life. It captured the pale, sweat-slicked face of the trapped driver. And it captured Elena, her movements economical and precise, a beacon of calm professionalism in the storm. The audio was crystal clear. It recorded Corbin's initial aggressive demand for her to step back. It recorded Elena's firm but respectful reply: "I'm the lead paramedic. This man is a critical trauma. I'm not going anywhere." The camera showed that Corbin never once checked on the patient. His focus was entirely on Elena. He didn't ask about the driver's condition or what he could do to help. His only concern was establishing his own authority. The video showed him moving closer, physically blocking her path. His voice, amplified by the camera's microphone, was sharp and demanding. I'm ordering you to clear the immediate area. Elena's response was exactly as she had described. Your crime scene will be a homicide scene if we don't get him out. The most critical portion of the video was the exchange over her identification. I need to see your identification, now, Corbin demanded. The camera angle showed Elena's hands never stopped working inside the vehicle. It's in the ambulance, she replied, her voice strained with the urgency of her task. I'm a little busy keeping this man from bleeding to death. You are actively interfering with emergency medical care. The footage directly contradicted the official report Corbin had filed. In his report, he claimed Elena had squared off against him in a threatening manner and yelled obscenities. The video showed no such thing. It showed a paramedic trying to do her job and an officer becoming increasingly agitated because his orders weren't being instantly obeyed. It recorded him grabbing her arm, her sharp command to, "Take your hands off me," and the final shocking moment of the arrest. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was sickeningly loud. But the video didn't end there. It continued for another 20 minutes, recording Corbin's self-serving radio transmissions as he drove her to the station. It recorded his conversation with Sergeant Miller, where he again painted himself as the victim of her belligerence. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Samuel Drake slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Well, he said, his voice quiet but filled with a cold fury. He's finished. The body camera, a tool intended to promote police accountability, had done its job perfectly. It had not just captured a wrongful arrest, it had captured the very anatomy of an abuse of power. It was an unimpeachable witness, a silent narrator whose testimony could not be cross-examined, intimidated, or altered. It was the truth, recorded at 30 frames per second, and it was going to tear Mark Corbin's career apart. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It is a sterile, almost clinical proceeding, typically held in a law firm's conference room. But for the person under oath, it can be a crucible. For Officer Mark Corbin, it was the day his carefully constructed world began to crumble. He walked into the deposition flanked by 2 attorneys from the city and a union representative, his expression a mask of confident defiance. He was wearing his full dress uniform, an unsubtle attempt to project authority and credibility. Samuel Drake, dressed in a simple dark suit, greeted them with a polite nod and directed them to their seats across the long, polished table. A court reporter sat at the head, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine. The entire proceeding was also being videotaped. Officer Corbin, Drake began, his voice calm and conversational. Could you please state your name and badge number for the record? Corbin did so, his voice steady. For the first hour, Drake asked routine questions about Corbin's training, his years on the force, and his understanding of police procedure at an accident scene. It was a slow, methodical process designed to lull him into a state of comfort. Then, Drake shifted gears. Officer, I'd like to turn your attention to your official report regarding the arrest of my client, Ms. Rostova. You wrote here, Drake said, tapping a copy of the report, that Ms. Rostova was verbally aggressive and yelling. Is that correct? Yes, Corbin said, leaning into his microphone. She was highly agitated and uncooperative. And you also wrote that she refused to provide any form of identification. Is that your testimony today? That is correct. Drake nodded slowly. Let's watch something together, shall we? He gestured to a large television screen at the end of the room. He played the first segment of the body cam footage, the initial interaction between Corbin and Elena. He paused the video. Officer, in that clip we hear Ms. Rostova state, and I quote, "I'm the lead paramedic. This man is a critical trauma." Would you characterize that statement as yelling? Corbin shifted in his seat. The video doesn't capture the full intensity of the situation. The video captures what the video captures, officer, Drake said, his voice hardening slightly. Let's continue. He played the next clip, the one where Corbin demands her ID. It's in the ambulance, Elena's voice said from the speakers. Drake paused it again. Officer, My client has just told you where her identification is. Your report says she refused to provide any form of identification. Those two things seem to be in direct conflict. Can you explain that discrepancy? The city's attorney objected. Argumentative. Overruled in my head, Drake muttered before rephrasing. Officer, did you hear Ms. Rostova tell you where her ID was? I may have, Corbin conceded, his confident facade beginning to crack. I was focused on securing the scene. For the next 4 hours, Drake continued this relentless process, dissecting Corbin's report line by line and holding it up against the unflinching reality of the video. He made Corbin watch the moment he grabbed Elena's arm. In your use of force report, you state you used a control hold to counter her physical resistance. Officer, please point to the physical resistance on the screen. Corbin stared at the frozen image of Elena, her hands still reaching toward her patient. He was silent. The city attorney interjected, "The officer perceived resistance." "The officer can perceive whatever he wants," Drake shot back. "The video shows what happened." The climax came when Drake brought up Corbin's radio call. He played the audio in the silent room. Corbin's voice filled the air. Subject was a paramedic on scene, became belligerent and uncooperative. "Officer Corbin," Drake said, leaning forward, "you made that statement just minutes after the arrest. You knew it was being recorded. You knew it was an official transmission. And you had to know, having just lived through the event, that it was not true. So my question is this. Did you lie in your official report and in your radio transmission to cover up a wrongful arrest? Or is your perception of reality so profoundly different from what this camera recorded that you are unfit to wear that uniform?" The union rep shouted, "Objection!" The city's attorneys were on their feet, but the damage was done. The video camera in the corner had captured Corbin's face, pale and sweating under the hot lights, his lies exposed for all to see. The deposition, which he had walked into as a formality, had become his personal trial, and the verdict, captured forever on tape, was guilty. The fallout from Mark Corbin's disastrous deposition was immediate and seismic. The videotaped recording of him stammering, contradicting himself, and being repeatedly cornered by the body cam footage was a legal smoking gun. When Samuel Drake submitted the transcript and video as part of a motion for summary judgment, he effectively laid a ticking bomb on the desks of the city's legal department. They now understood they were not dealing with a he said, she said situation. They were facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence that portrayed one of their officers as, at best, incompetent and dishonest, and at worst, a malicious abuser of his authority. The political calculus changed overnight. The quiet internal hope of defending Corbin and winning on qualified immunity evaporated. The new strategy was damage control. 2 days after the deposition, Drake received a call. It was the lead attorney for the city of Phoenix. The tone was no longer adversarial. It was conciliatory. He wanted to talk. "Sam," the city attorney said, the first-name basis a clear signal of the shift. "We've reviewed the deposition. We believe there may be a path to resolving this matter amicably." Drake knew what was coming. "I'm listening," he said, keeping his own tone neutral. The city was now prepared to make a formal settlement offer. They would issue a public apology to Elena Rostova, acknowledging that her arrest was a mistake. They would expunge the arrest from her record completely. All of Officer Corbin's reports related to the incident would be rescinded, and they were prepared to offer a financial settlement of $750,000 to compensate for her damages. It was a significant offer, far more than the nuisance value settlements typically seen in such cases. It was a clear admission of guilt, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding before the case could go to a jury, where the body cam footage would inevitably be played for the public to see. Drake convened a meeting with Elena that evening. He laid out the offer in its entirety, explaining the pros and cons. "It's a strong offer, Elena," he said. "It achieves several of our initial goals. Your name is cleared, you're compensated, and the city is forced to admit fault. A trial is always a risk. Juries can be unpredictable. This is a guaranteed win. Elena listened quietly, her hands folded on the table. She considered the offer for a long moment. $750,000 was a life-changing amount of money. A public apology would be a powerful vindication. She could put this all behind her, go back to her life, and try to forget the feeling of the handcuffs on her wrists. But then she thought about the 37 other complaints. She thought about the system that had protected Corbin, that had dismissed every single warning sign until he finally went too far in front of a dozen cameras. She thought about the patient whose life had been put at risk. A settlement would compensate her, but would it change anything? Corbin would likely be disciplined, maybe suspended, but would he be fired? Would the department change its policies? Would another paramedic, maybe one without her military background and iron will, face the same choice and be intimidated into letting a patient die? What happens to Officer Corbin if we accept this? She asked. Drake sighed. The department will conduct its own internal review. With a settlement of this size, he'll likely face serious discipline. He might even be terminated. But there are no guarantees. The police union is powerful. They could fight it, get it reduced to a long suspension. So he could be back on the street in a year, Elena stated. It wasn't a question. It's possible, Drake admitted. Elena looked him in the eye. Her decision was made. Then the answer is no, she said, her voice unwavering. This isn't about me, and it isn't about the money. This is about making sure he can never do this to anyone ever again. It's about changing the system that let him get away with it for so long. Tell them we'll see them in court. Drake couldn't help but smile. He had hoped she would say that. They're not going to like that, he said. Good, Elena replied. The city had tried to buy its way out of accountability. They were about to learn that Elena Rostova's integrity was not for sale. The city's rejection of their settlement offer, combined with the damning deposition of Officer Corbin, forced Samuel Drake's hand. He had been holding his most powerful weapon in reserve, but the time for quiet legal maneuvering was over. He made a strategic decision to leak the body camera footage to a local investigative news reporter known for her tough coverage of law enforcement issues. The result was explosive. The news station ran a 10-minute segment leading their 10 p.m. broadcast. It opened with the shocking footage. Elena working on her patient, Corbin's aggressive confrontation, the unbelievable moment of the arrest. They intercut the video with clips from Corbin's deposition, showing him squirming as he was confronted with his own lies. They interviewed a use-of-force expert who broke down the incident, calling Corbin's actions a dangerous and unjustifiable abuse of authority. They even found and interviewed two of the people who had filed previous complaints against Corbin, who tearfully recounted their own experiences with him. By the next morning, the story was no longer local. It was national. The video went viral. It was on every major news network, every social media feed. The hashtag Paramedic Elena trended for 3 days straight. Elena Rostova, who had always defined herself by her quiet competence and her desire to stay out of the spotlight, was suddenly a household name. She was a symbol. To some, she was a hero, a professional who had stood her ground for her patient. To others, she was a resistor, a figurehead for a growing public frustration with police overreach. The raw video resonated with millions. People could see themselves in her situation, a professional just trying to do their job, confronted by an official on a power trip. The incident was no longer an abstract legal case. It was a visceral, easily understood drama that played out in real time. The public outcry was massive and unrelenting. The police department's social media pages were flooded with angry comments. The mayor's office was inundated with calls demanding Corbin's termination. National paramedic and firefighter unions issued statements of solidarity, condemning the arrest and calling for systemic changes to protect first responders. Rallies were organized outside City Hall, with off-duty paramedics, nurses, and doctors marching in their scrubs, holding signs that read, "Patient care is not obstruction," and "We stand with Elena." The lawsuit was transformed. It was no longer a private dispute between one woman and a city. It had become a public referendum on the limits of police authority and the sanctity of the medic-patient relationship. The media firestorm put immense pressure on the city government. They were now facing not just a massive legal liability, but a full-blown public relations catastrophe. The mayor gave a press conference promising a full and transparent investigation. The police chief announced that Officer Corbin had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal and criminal investigations. For Elena, the sudden fame was deeply unsettling. She was hounded by reporters. Her picture was everywhere. But she also saw the power in it. She agreed to one carefully controlled interview with the reporter who had broken the story. On camera, she was calm, articulate, and professional. She didn't rail against the police. She simply explained her duty as a paramedic. "My job is to focus on my patient," she said, looking directly into the camera. "That is my only priority. In that moment, my patient was dying, and I did what I was trained to do. I would do it again tomorrow. The question isn't why I didn't comply. The question is why an officer would believe his paperwork was more important than a human life." Her words became a rallying cry. The case had tapped into a deep vein of public sentiment, turning a personal fight for justice into a nationwide movement demanding accountability. The city had wanted to keep the incident quiet. Now the whole world was watching. The bright glare of the media spotlight often illuminates things hiding in the shadows. As the story of Elena's arrest dominated the news cycle, a retired Phoenix police officer named Frank Miller found himself unable to sleep. Frank wasn't related to the booking sergeant. He was a former patrol officer who had been Mark Corbin's partner for 2 years, long before the I-10 incident. He had retired 5 years ago on a medical pension, his conscience heavy with things he had seen and, more importantly, things he had failed to stop. He watched the body cam footage of Elena's arrest on his television, and a cold, familiar sickness churned in his gut. He recognized the look in Corbin's eyes, the aggressive posture, the way he escalated a situation that required none. He had seen it a dozen times before, but this time was different. This time there was a camera. This time Corbin had picked on the wrong person. After a week of wrestling with his conscience, Frank Miller made a phone call. He didn't call the police department or the media. He called the number for Samuel Drake's law firm that he saw on the news. The next day, he was sitting in the same conference room where Corbin's deposition had taken place. He was nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of coffee. "I was his partner," Frank began, his voice raspy. "For 2 years, when he was just a rookie. I saw the signs early on, the temper, the need to win every argument, dominate every encounter. He loved the authority of the badge more than the responsibility of it." Drake listened patiently, letting the man talk. "There were incidents," Frank continued, his gaze fixed on the table. "Things that never made it into the reports. Or they made it in, but changed." He then told Drake about a specific incident, a domestic violence call where the suspect had already left. The victim, a young woman, was upset and yelling. Corbin, instead of de-escalating, got in her face, screaming back at her. When she told him to get out of her house, he arrested her for obstruction. "The report he wrote was pure fiction," Frank said, shaking his head. "He claimed she assaulted him, that she was a threat. I signed it. I was the senior officer. I should have stopped it, but I was a few years from my pension. I had kids in college. I took the easy way out. I told myself it was a one-time thing." But it wasn't. Frank recounted 2 other instances where Corbin had used excessive force and then blatantly falsified the report to justify it. In each case, Frank had been the backup officer, and in each case, he had signed the false report, becoming a silent accomplice. The guilt had eaten away at him for years. "I kept copies," Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. He reached into a worn leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were his original handwritten notes from those incidents, along with photocopies of Corbin's initial falsified reports before they were officially typed and submitted. The documents were a bombshell. They were concrete proof of a pattern of deception. They showed that Corbin had a history of fabricating official documents to cover up his misconduct. More damningly, they proved that internal affairs, had they conducted even a cursory investigation by separating and interviewing the partners, would have uncovered the truth. This was the evidence Drake needed to blow the case wide open. Frank Miller's testimony and his documents elevated the lawsuit from a case about one wrongful arrest to a RICO-level conspiracy. It wasn't just that the city had failed to discipline a problem officer, it was that the system had actively enabled and covered up his crimes. Frank Miller was a whistleblower, a man whose conscience had finally outweighed his fear. His testimony provided the missing link, the internal proof that would make it impossible for the city to claim ignorance. They didn't just employ a rogue officer, they had cultivated one. As Frank left the law office that day, he looked like a man who had unburdened himself of a great weight. He had finally done the right thing, and in doing so, he had just handed Samuel Drake the key to dismantling the city's entire defense. Armed with Frank Miller's testimony and documents, Samuel Drake's legal strategy underwent a radical expansion. The target was no longer just Officer Mark Corbin. It was the entire ecosystem of negligence and corruption within the Phoenix Police Department that had allowed him to operate with impunity. Drake filed a motion to amend the lawsuit, adding new charges under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act, a law typically used to prosecute organized crime. He argued that the pattern of falsified reports, rubber-stamped internal investigations, and consistent failure to discipline constituted a form of institutional racketeering designed to systematically deprive citizens of their civil rights. The move was bold, aggressive, and it sent shockwaves through the city's legal department. This was no longer a case they could hope to contain. It was an indictment of their entire culture. The discovery process was reopened with a new, much wider scope. Drake's team now had the legal grounds to subpoena years of internal affairs records, not just for Corbin, but for the entire department. They deposed Sergeant Miller, the booking sergeant, who testified under oath that problem officers like Corbin were often referred to as frequent flyers, but that meaningful discipline was exceedingly rare, especially when the union got involved. They deposed Corbin's former supervisors, who admitted under questioning that they had relied solely on his written reports and had never questioned his version of events, even when complaints piled up. They brought in a nationally recognized police practices expert to analyze the department's policies. The expert's report was scathing. He concluded that the Phoenix PD's internal affairs process was functionally designed to exonerate officers, not to seek truth. He pointed to a lack of mandatory outside oversight, a peer review system where officers investigated their friends, and a disciplinary matrix so full of loopholes that termination was virtually impossible for anything short of a criminal conviction. The picture that emerged was one of a deeply broken system. Mark Corbin was not an anomaly, he was a product. He was what happened when a person with authoritarian tendencies was given a badge and a gun, and then repeatedly taught that there would be no consequences for his actions. Each of the 37 times a complaint against him was dismissed, the system sent him a clear message: your conduct is acceptable. We have your back. The lawsuit began to meticulously document this systemic failure. They created a timeline that showed how, after each exonerated complaint, Corbin's aggression escalated. He learned he could get away with a little more each time. The verbal abuse in his early years became the illegal searches, which then became the excessive force, culminating in the brazen arrest of a paramedic in broad daylight. He wasn't a bad apple. He was the predictable fruit of a poisoned tree. The city's lawyers were in an impossible position. Every piece of evidence Drake's team uncovered seemed to make things worse. The whistleblower, the expert report, the depositions of senior officers. It all painted a picture of a department that was, at best, willfully blind, and at worst, complicit in the abuse of its citizens. They were no longer defending one officer's mistake. They were defending a decade of institutional failure. The financial liability had ballooned. A jury wouldn't just be looking at compensating Elena for a wrongful arrest. They would be looking at assigning punitive damages for a department that had knowingly endangered the public for years. The cost of a potential trial verdict was now not just in the millions, but potentially in the tens of millions. The case had become a monster, and it was threatening to devour the city's budget and the police department's reputation. The time for settlement offers was over. The city was backed into a corner, and their only remaining option was to pray for a miracle in mediation. Mediation is the last off-ramp on the long highway to a jury trial. It's a final, structured attempt to find a resolution before both sides hand their fate over to 12 strangers. The chosen mediator was a retired federal judge named Arthur Vance, a man with a reputation for sharp intellect and a complete lack of patience for nonsense. The session was held in a neutral, wood-paneled suite of offices. On one side of the table sat Elena, Samuel Drake, and his legal team. On the other side sat the city's lead attorneys, a representative from the mayor's office, and the police chief himself. Officer Corbin was not present. At this stage, he was merely a liability they were trying to contain. Judge Vance began the session by having both sides present a summary of their case. The city's attorneys went first, making a subdued argument about the unpredictable nature of chaotic accident scenes and an officer's need to make split-second decisions. They acknowledged mistakes were made, but argued that there was no evidence of malice or a systemic conspiracy. Their presentation was professional but lacked conviction. They were men trying to put the best possible face on a catastrophic hand. Then it was Drake's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use inflammatory language. He simply and methodically laid out the evidence. He started with the body camera video, playing key clips on a large monitor. The room was silent as the footage showed Corbin's aggression and Elena's professionalism. Next, he presented the deposition video, showing Corbin's lies unraveling under oath. He followed that with the summary of the 37 prior complaints and their uniform dismissals. He then introduced the sworn affidavit from the whistleblower, Frank Miller, complete with copies of the falsified reports. Finally, he presented the damning conclusion from their police practices expert, who characterized the department's oversight as a complete systemic failure. When he finished, the air in the room was thick with tension. Judge Vance, who had listened without interruption, steepled his fingers and stared at the city's delegation for a long, uncomfortable minute. "All right," Vance said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "I'm going to ask Ms. Rostova and her counsel to step into the other room for a few minutes. I need to speak with the city alone." Once Drake and Elena had left, Vance's demeanor changed. The calm impartiality vanished, replaced by a brutal frankness. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, looking directly at the police chief and the city attorney. "I have mediated over 500 cases in my career. I have never, and I mean never, seen a plaintiff's case this strong and a defendant's case this weak. You have nothing." He picked up the expert report. "Your internal affairs process is a joke. You have a documented history of this officer's escalating aggression. You have a whistleblower from inside your own department testifying to a cover-up. And you have your officer on videotape lying his teeth out during a sworn deposition." He leaned forward, his eyes like steel. "Let me paint you a picture of what happens if this goes to trial. Mr. Drake is going to play that body cam video for the jury. Then he's going to put that paramedic, a woman who served her country as a pararescueman, on the stand. She will be the most credible, sympathetic witness they have ever seen. Then he will put your officer on the stand and impeach him with his own lies. By the time he's done, the jury won't just be angry. They will be offended. They will feel a moral obligation to punish you." He sat back. "Your last offer was $750,000. You are not in that ballpark anymore. You are not even in the same sport. You are facing a verdict that will start with a 2 and have 7 zeros after it, and that's before punitive damages. Settle this case. Settle it today. Because if you don't, what's coming for you is not a lawsuit. It's an extinction-level event." The judge's words, stripped of all legal jargon, were a stark and terrifying prophecy. The room was silent. The city's last hope had just told them they had no hope at all. Judge Vance's blunt assessment shattered any remaining illusions the city's representatives held. The bravado was gone, replaced by the grim pragmatism of disaster management. When the two parties reconvened, the atmosphere had changed completely. The negotiation was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about the size of the crater. The city's attorneys, now pale and subdued, began a new round of negotiations, this time with a sense of desperation. Drake, holding all the cards, was unyielding. He wasn't just negotiating for money, he was negotiating for change. The back and forth lasted for 8 grueling hours. Drake would present a demand. The city's team would retreat to another room to make frantic calls to the mayor and the city council, and they would return with a counteroffer. The financial number climbed steadily. It went from the initial offer of $750,000 to $5 million, then 10, then 15. But Drake kept pushing back on the other, more critical terms. Finally, as dusk settled outside the windows, they reached an agreement. It was a landmark settlement, one of the largest in the state's history for a civil rights case against a police department. The final number was $18.2 million. The figure was staggering, a clear signal to the world of the magnitude of the city's culpability. But the true victory for Elena and Drake was in the non-monetary terms, the mandatory institutional reforms that were written into the settlement agreement and would be enforceable by a federal court. First, Officer Mark Corbin would be terminated immediately. The city agreed not to contest his unemployment and to provide all evidence from the civil case to the county attorney's office with a formal recommendation for criminal charges of perjury and official oppression. There would be no quiet resignation, no negotiated exit. His career in law enforcement was over. Second, the Phoenix Police Department was required to completely overhaul its internal affairs division. The new process would include a civilian oversight board with the power to conduct independent investigations. The unfounded finding would be eliminated for cases with conflicting evidence, replaced by a not sustained finding that would still count toward an officer's complaint history. Third, the department would implement a mandatory computer-based early warning system. Any officer who accumulated more than 3 use-of-force complaints or 5 total civilian complaints in a 2-year period would be automatically flagged for intervention, which would include mandatory retraining and psychological evaluation. Fourth, the settlement mandated the creation of a new statewide training module for all police recruits and active duty officers on proper procedures for interacting with emergency medical personnel at incident scenes. The training would explicitly state that the medical authority of a licensed paramedic over patient care is paramount, and that interference with that care is grounds for immediate termination. When Drake presented the final terms to Elena, she felt a profound sense of relief that had little to do with the money. They had achieved what she had set out to do. They had forced accountability. They had implemented changes that would protect others. The $18.2 million wasn't compensation. It was a punishment. It was a price tag for a decade of negligence, a bill for a culture of corruption that had finally come due. As they signed the documents, the police chief, his face grim, shook Drake's hand and gave Elena a curt nod. He knew this settlement was more than a legal defeat. It was a public humiliation and the beginning of a long, painful process of rebuilding trust his department had forfeited. Justice, in the end, had a price. And for the city of Phoenix, that price was a public reckoning and a check for $18.2 million. Elena Rostova never wanted to be a public figure. She was a paramedic, a doer, a woman who found purpose in the quiet, competent moments of saving a life. But the lawsuit and its high-profile settlement thrust her into a role she hadn't sought, that of an advocate. She discovered that her story, backed by the viral video and the massive settlement, was a powerful tool for change. Instead of retreating back into the anonymity of her ambulance, she decided to use her newfound platform. She partnered with Samuel Drake and the state's largest first responder unions to address the systemic issue that had led to her arrest in the first place: the legal gray area surrounding a paramedic's authority at an emergency scene. While medical protocols were clear, the law was often vague about what happened when a police officer's order conflicted with a medic's duty of care. They decided to change the law itself. They drafted a piece of legislation they called the First Responder Shield Act. The bill was simple, direct, and unambiguous. It legally codified that a licensed emergency medical provider, paramedic, EMT, etc., engaged in active patient care has primary authority over that patient's immediate medical treatment. The law explicitly made it a felony for any person, including a law enforcement officer, to knowingly and physically interfere with that care unless the medical provider was committing a clear act of gross negligence or a violent crime. It provided legal immunity to any first responder who refused an order that would compromise patient care. In essence, it gave paramedics the legal armor they needed to do their jobs without fear of reprisal from an overzealous official. Getting a law passed is a political marathon, but Elena's case provided the perfect catalyst. The body camera footage became their Exhibit A. They screened it for legislative committees at the state capitol. Lawmakers who might have been inclined to reflexively side with law enforcement watched in stunned silence as a paramedic was handcuffed while trying to save a life. Elena testified before the Health and Human Services Committee. She didn't come with legal arguments, she came with her story. She spoke in her uniform, her voice steady and professional, describing the impossible choice she faced. "Legislators," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber, "no one who dedicates their life to saving others should ever have to choose between their patient and their freedom. We need you to draw a clear line in the law so that the next time this happens, the officer knows they are the one breaking it." The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: the man whose life she had saved. His name was Michael Chen, a 48-year-old architect and father of two. He had made a full recovery after 2 surgeries and months of rehabilitation. He walked to the podium with a slight limp, the only visible remnant of his ordeal. He told the committee what he remembered: the crushing pain, the feeling of his life slipping away, and the sound of arguing voices above him. "I was dying," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And the only thing standing between me and death was that woman right there. The idea that she was arrested for refusing to abandon me is not just wrong, it's insane. Please pass this law. Do it for the next person who is trapped in a car, bleeding, and praying that the person with the medical kit is allowed to do their job." His testimony was devastatingly effective. The bill, which might have otherwise languished in committee, gained unstoppable momentum. It passed both houses of the state legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support. 6 months after the settlement, Elena stood beside the governor as he signed the First Responder Shield Act into law. The signing pen was given to her as a souvenir. A wrongful arrest on a stretch of asphalt had led to a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, which in turn had led to an ironclad legal protection for thousands of first responders across the state. It was a legacy forged in trauma, but one that would ensure no other medic would have to endure what she did. The ripples from Elena Rostova's stand on that sun-scorched highway continued to spread long after the ink on the settlement checks and the new law had dried. Mark Corbin was terminated as promised. The county attorney, facing immense public pressure and armed with the evidence from the civil suit, charged him with perjury and official oppression. Corbin, abandoned by the city and the union that could no longer defend his toxic reputation, pleaded guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge to avoid jail time. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation and was permanently stripped of his law enforcement certification, ensuring he could never wear a badge in that state, or any other, again. The Phoenix Police Department began the painful and public process of implementing the court-mandated reforms. The new Civilian Oversight Board was contentious and met with resistance from the rank and file, but its presence began to slowly chip away at the monolithic blue wall of silence. The early warning system flagged 24 officers in its first year, forcing the department to address problem behavior before it could escalate into a federal lawsuit. The training module created as part of the settlement, which featured Elena's body cam footage as a prime example of what not to do, became required viewing for police academies across the country. Her case was added to legal and medical ethics textbooks. It became a case study in how one person's refusal to back down in the face of injustice could trigger a cascade of systemic change. Elena herself used a significant portion of her settlement to establish a non-profit foundation called the Shield Foundation. Its mission was to provide legal support and advocacy for first responders who faced retaliation or wrongful disciplinary action for prioritizing patient care. It funded legal battles for paramedics in other states, helped unions negotiate for stronger protections in their contracts, and continued to lobby for similar SHIELD laws across the nation. Within 5 years, 7 other states had passed similar legislation, each one citing the Rostova case as a key precedent. Elena returned to her job as a paramedic. She went back to 24-hour shifts in Unit 61, responding to the daily tide of human crisis. The money hadn't changed her, but the experience had. There was a new weight to her, a quiet authority that went beyond her medical skills. At scenes, police officers treated her with a new level of respect, sometimes even deference. Younger paramedics looked at her with a kind of awe. She was a living legend in their world, a symbol of integrity. She had fought the battle they all feared and had not only won, but had changed the rules of the game for everyone. Her story became a piece of EMS folklore, a reminder that their duty to their patient was sacrosanct, and that they had the power, and now the legal right, to defend it. The real impact of her stand wasn't measured in dollars or laws, but in the countless moments that didn't happen afterward. The paramedic who wasn't intimidated, the argument that was avoided, the patient whose care wasn't delayed because an officer had seen the video and thought twice. It was an echo, a lasting vibration of an act of courage that continued to protect people long after the initial event had faded into memory. The storm has passed. What remains is the quiet landscape of what if and why. At its core, Mark Corbin's catastrophic decision was likely not born from a desire to be evil, but from a desperate, fragile need to be in control. Perhaps in his past, in his training, or in his life, he experienced a moment of powerlessness that terrified him. That fear may have curdled into a rigid, authoritarian mindset where any challenge, no matter how reasonable, was perceived as a threat to his very identity. The badge didn't just give him authority. It was a shield for his insecurity. When Elena Rostova, a calm, competent professional, prioritized her duty over his demand, she didn't just question his order. She unknowingly struck at the foundation of his fragile ego. His aggression was the panicked lashing out of a man terrified of being seen as irrelevant. If Elena had been a rookie, less sure of her skills and her rights, would she have backed down? Almost certainly. The patient's care would have been delayed, and he might have died, becoming another tragic statistic. If she had simply complied, the moment would have passed, and Corbin's pattern of abuse would have continued, unchecked, until another, perhaps more tragic, confrontation. Her unique combination of elite training, combat experience, and innate fortitude created the perfect catalyst for this long-overdue reckoning. It took a will of iron to break a system of rust. The lesson here is profound. It teaches us that true authority is not demanded, but earned through competence and respect. It shows that integrity is not just about what you do when people are watching, but about refusing to compromise your core duties even when the personal cost is high. It reminds us that systems, no matter how powerful, are made of people, And sometimes it takes just one person standing firm on a line drawn on asphalt to bend the arc of the entire system toward justice. What would you have done if you were in Elena's boots? At what point does a lawful order become an unlawful one? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if stories of quiet heroes inspire you, consider supporting the channel.